Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's commander is Judith the Scourge Diva. Judith is a 2/2 human shaman that costs 1 black-red. She has other creatures you control get +1/+0, and whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Judith the Scourge Diva deals 1 damage to any target. So first off, Judith pumps our team to make us a little bit more aggressive. And then she also gives us a benefit for whenever one of our non-token creatures dies. So what's our strategy with this deck? Well, we're going to get recurable creatures and sacrifice outlets out with our commander. So we're going to be running an Aristocrat style strategy, but again, we have to focus on non-token creatures. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to sacrifice our creatures for value and then hurt our opponents with those sacrifices. We're going to be running plenty of Death Matters effects in this deck outside of Judith. So we're going to have plenty of options on how we want to go about winning this game. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's start off with tactic number 1, skipping stones. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Then there's Mindstone, which we can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card. Next up, we've got a couple of mana rocks that can help us ramp and fix our mana. Prismatic Lens can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 into it to tap to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Sphere of the Suns is going to enter the battlefield tapped with 3 charge counters on it, and we can tap to remove one of those charge counters to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And then Star Compass enters the battlefield tapped, and it's going to tap to add 1 mana of either of our colors depending on our land situation. And then we're going to be running Rakdos Locket, which can either tap for black or red, or we can pay 4 Rakdos into it and tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. Our final mana rock is going to be Unstable Obelisk, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 7 into it to tap and sacrifice it to destroy target permanent. Rakdos decks in general can have troubles dealing with certain types of permanents, so this can come in huge. And finally, we're going to be running some creatures that can also help us ramp. First, there's Pawn of Ulamog, which says whenever Pawn of Ulamog or another non-token creature you control dies, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sacrifice this creature to add colorless to your mana pool. Sifter of Skulls is very similar to Pawn of Ulamog, but it has some slight differences. First off, we don't get any benefit from it actually dying. It has to be another non-token creature. But instead of creating Eldrazi spawns, it's going to create 1/1 Eldrazi scions. And finally, there's Pitiless Plunderer, which has whenever another creature you control dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token. Again, with this deck, we're going to be sacrificing a ton of creatures, so these 3 cards can really help us ramp. So what are some of those creatures that we're going to be sacrificing? Let's go through a few of them now in tactic number 2, Imperfect Immortality. First up, there's Tenacious Dead, which has whenever it dies, you may pay 1 in a black, and if you do, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So as long as we have the mana available whenever it dies, we can recur it every single time. And then we're going to be running Bloodsoaked Champion, which has Raid. Pay 1 in a black, return Bloodsoaked Champion from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate this ability only if you attacked with a creature this turn. This is a very small and easy requirement for this deck to meet. And next up, there's Nim Devourer, which has pay black, return Nim Devourer from your graveyard to play, and then sacrifice a creature. Play this ability only during your upkeep. Again, with this deck, we don't mind sacrificing creatures, so this is a fantastic recurable effect. But perhaps the best of these recurable creatures is Reassembling Skeleton. At any time, we can just pay 1 in a black to return it from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And then we're going to be running some creatures that go about this in a different way. First, there's Endless Cockroaches, and when it dies, we get to return it back to our hand. While this doesn't put it straight on the battlefield, it's still a great effect in order for us to continue to recast it so that we can sacrifice it over and over again. And finally, we're going to be running Squee Goblin Nabob and Squee the Immortal. Squee Goblin Nabob has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may return Squee Goblin Nabob from your graveyard to your hand. And Squee the Immortal has, you may cast Squee the Immortal from your graveyard or from exile. All of these creatures, though, are fantastic sacrifice targets for us. But we're not done just yet, so let's go through some more in tactic number 3, I'm Not Dead Yet. First up is Murderous Redcap, which has, when it enters the battlefield, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. But the main reason that we have it in this deck is because it has Persist. So when Murderous Redcap dies, as long as it didn't have a -1/-1 counter on it, we get it back and then we put that -1/-1 counter on it. So basically we get to sacrifice this creature twice. And Wing Rattle Scarecrow has Persist as long as we control a black creature, and that's not too hard for us to do. Another creature with persist that we're running in this deck is Puppeteer Click. Puppeteer Click has, when it enters the battlefield, put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. It gains haste. At the beginning of your next end step, exile it. So this card can actually come in huge for this deck because it's going to give us a total of 4 creatures for us to sacrifice. And then there's Butcher Ghoul, which has Undying, which is very similar to persist. But instead of it being a -1/-1 counter, it's going to be a +1/+1 counter. And finally, we're going to be running Pyreheart Wolf, which not only has Undying, but it also has, whenever it attacks, creatures you control gain menace until the end of the turn. But with all these great targets, we need some ways to sacrifice them. So let's go through some of those ways now in tactic number 4, Power Outlet. First up, there's Carrion Feeder, Bloodthorn Vampire, and Bloodflow Connoisseur. Each of these can sacrifice any creature that we have for free while pumping themselves. And then we've got some sacrifice outlets that are a little harder for our opponents to deal with. First, there's Yahenni Undying Partisan, which has, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Yahenni Undying Partisan. And at any time, we can sacrifice another creature to give Yahenni indestructible until the end of the turn. This deck is very effective at killing a ton of creatures, so Yahenni can become a huge threat. And then there's Falkenrath Aristocrat, which has flying and haste, and we can sacrifice a creature to give it indestructible until the end of the turn. On top of that, if that sacrificed creature was a human, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Next up is Dimir Houseguard, which has sacrifice a creature, regenerate Dimir Houseguard. On top of that, it has Transmute for 1 black, so we can discard this card and then search our library for a card with the same converted mana cost and put it into our hand. Not only is this card a fantastic sacrifice outlet, but it can even go find us that perfect card that we need. Finally, we're going to be running Thermopod, which has sacrifice a creature, add red to your mana pool. So not only is this card a great sacrifice outlet, but it's also a fantastic way for us to ramp ourselves. There are plenty of combinations in this deck that can go infinite, and Thermopod is at the heart of a lot of those. So we're going to be sacrificing a lot of non-token creatures with this deck, which is going to trigger Judith. But it's also going to trigger some of our other value cards that help us dig deeper into the deck. So let's go through those and some other cards that help us dig deeper in tactic number 5, Triggered. First up, there's Siphon Mine, which says each other player discards a card and you draw a card for each card discarded this way. In Commander, this basically means that each other player is going to discard a card and we get to draw 3 cards. And that's an incredible amount of value for just 4 mana. And then there's Smothering Abomination, which has, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature, and whenever you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. This deck actually wants us to sacrifice creatures, so that first part isn't even a downside. And then being able to draw a card every single time that we sacrifice a creature is a huge amount of value for this deck. Next up, we've got a couple more cards that provide us with an incredible amount of value. Gate to the Afterlife has, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you gain 1 life, then you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. While this isn't technically card advantage, it is looting, which does help us out. Grim Haruspex is similar, but it does actually provide us card advantage. It has, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, draw a card. Dark Prophecy takes it to another level by saying whenever any of your creatures dies, draw a card and lose 1 life. And next up there's Harvester of Souls, which says whenever another non-token creature dies, you may draw a card. So not only does this count our non-token creatures, but it also counts our opponents. And this deck can be very effective at killing our opponent's creatures, so this is going to come in huge. And then we're going to be running Heirloom Blade, which says whenever a equipped creature dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card that shares a creature type with it. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And this deck has plenty of creatures that share a creature type, so we're going to be getting a lot of card advantage out of this. And finally, we're going to be running a few tutors with Corpse Connoisseur and Final Parting. Corpse Connoisseur has, when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card and put that card into your graveyard. If you do, shuffle your library. On top of that, it has Unearthed for 3 and a black, so we can do this twice. So this card can come in huge by getting us one of our best recurable creatures like Reassembling Skeleton and putting it directly into our graveyard. With Final Parting, we get to search our library for 2 cards, one goes into our hand and the other goes into our graveyard. So with this deck, this is just basically tutor for 2 cards. So with this deck though, we want to make sure that we can protect our position by protecting our commander and getting our creatures back. So let's go through some ways to do that in tactic number 6, Back to Life. First up, there's Dark Privilege, which has sacrifice a creature, regenerate enchanted creature. So by putting this aura on Judith, not only do we protect her, but we also turn her into a fantastic sacrifice outlet. And then we're going to be running No Rest for the Wicked, which is an enchantment that we can sacrifice to return to our hand all creature cards that were put into our graveyard from play this turn. And Garden of the Bloodflame is very similar. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, return to your hand all creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from anywhere this turn. On top of that, it's going to give other creatures that we control haste, so it's going to help us be even more aggressive with this deck. Next up, there's Victimize, which says choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard. Sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So not only does this help us sacrifice a creature, but it also gets us 2 of our more important creatures back. Finally, we're going to be running Wake the Dead, which can be an absolute bomb with the right setup. We can only cast it during combat on an opponent's turn, but it's going to let us return X target creature cards from our graveyard to the battlefield, and then we have to sacrifice those creatures at the beginning of the next end step. Outside of Judith, we have other effects that help us either drain or ping our opponents when our creatures die. This card helps us get back a ton of creatures all at once that we can sacrifice to help decimate our opponents. Again, Judith has, whenever one of our non-token creatures dies, we get to have her deal 1 damage to any target. But there's a way to make that 1 damage be even more effective. So let's go through some cards that help us with that in tactic number 7, A Touch of Death. First up is Gorgon's Head and Gorgon Flail, kill, both of which pretty much do the exact same thing. They're equipment that are going to give the equipped creature Death Touch. By attaching either of these to Judith, it's going to make her extremely deadly, because as long as she has Death Touch, when she's pinging a creature, it's going to immediately die. So because of this, we're also going to be running Retreat to Aggro with this deck. It has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose one. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until the end of the turn, or each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Both of these can come in handy, but again, Death Touch is going to be much more detrimental to our opponents. But let's go through another keyword that's also going to be detrimental whenever Judith has it. So let's see what that is in tactic number 8, the Infection Spreads. First up, there's Phyresis, which is an aura that has Enchanted Creature has Infect. Engrafted Exoskeleton is very similar, but it's an equipment that's going to give +2/+2 and Infect. Infect is an extremely deadly keyword for Judith to have, because when she has either of these on, it's only going to take 10 damage for her to kill any of our opponents. And if we have the right setup with enough creatures in play to sacrifice, even Tainted Strike can do the job. It's an instant that's going to give +1/+0 and Infect to one of our creatures. This card can really come out of nowhere and take out our opponent immediately. But if we don't have one of these Infect cards, we can still kill our opponents the regular way. So let's go through some other creatures that are going to help Judith out in tactic number 9, a Modern Artist. First up, there's Zulaport Cutthroat, which has whenever it or another creature we control dies, each opponent is going to lose 1 life and we gain 1 life. Vindictive Vampire does the exact same thing, except it doesn't count itself in that. Unlike our commander, both of these creatures are fantastic at draining out all of our opponents at the same time. And then we're going to be running Hissing Iguanar, which has whenever another creature dies, you may have Hissing Iguanar deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. Falcon Wrath Noble is very similar. It has whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And Deathbringer Thokdar has some similarities too. It has whenever another creature dies, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Deathbringer Thokdar. And then you can remove a +1/+1 counter from Deathbringer Thokdar to have it deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So unlike our commander, all of these creatures take into account whenever our opponent's creatures die too. And then we've got some effects that can be even more damaging. First up is Stalking Vengeance, which has whenever another creature you control dies, it deals damage equal to its power to target player. This is a fantastic effect for this deck, especially because Judith pumps our creatures. And then there's Vicious Shadows, which has whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, you may have Vicious Shadows deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. This card can take down someone's life total from 40 to nothing in the blink of an eye. Next up, there's Flayer the Hatebound, which has Undying, and whenever Flayer the Hatebound or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. We've got plenty of other creatures that enter the battlefield from our graveyard, so this is going to deal a ton of damage to our opponents. And finally, there's Outpost Siege, which serves a dual purpose for this deck. When it enters the battlefield, we can either choose Khans or Dragons. If we choose Khans, at the beginning of our upkeep, we can exile the top card of our library, and until the end of the turn, we can play that card. And if we choose Dragons, whenever a creature that we control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege is going to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. So this card can either provide us with a ton of card advantage or actually help us finish out the game. Speaking of finishing out the game, let's go through some cards that help us with some pretty explosive finishes. Let's go through those cards now in tactic number 10, Hey Jude. First up, there's Butcher of Malakir, which has whenever it or another creature we control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. With this in play, it's going to be near impossible for any of our opponents to keep any of their creatures on the board. But there's a card that even decimates our opponent's decks even further, and that's the Golden Pig of the deck. The Golden Pig of the deck is the number 1 card out of our 99, and that card is Silverclad Ferocidons. Silverclad Ferocidons is an 8/5 dinosaur that costs 5 red. It has Enrage. Whenever Silverclad Ferocidons is dealt damage, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. This card is absolutely insane with our commander in play. Whenever one of our non-token creatures dies, we can have Judith ping Silverclad Ferocidons for 1 damage. This is going to force each of our opponents to sacrifice a permanent. And we can do this up to 4 times in a turn without killing Silverclad Ferocidons. If all 3 of our opponents are alive, that's a total of 12 permanents sacrificed in 1 turn. And that's just on 1 turn. Again, we can just keep doing this again over and over again each turn, making our opponents sacrifice more and more permanents. Before too long, our opponents won't have any permanents left to sacrifice and the game will be over. And that's what makes Silverclad Ferocidons the Golden Pig of the deck. But we've also got some other cards that are pretty effective at helping us close out the game. Embermaw Hellion has, if another red source you control will deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals that much damage +1 to that permanent or player instead. Since Judith is a red source, it's going to make you deal 2 damage now instead of 1. But Flame of Kel does this even better. With 1 lower counter, it's going to make us discard our hand, and then with 2, it's going to let us draw 2 cards. But once it gets to 3 lower counters, it says if a red source you control will deal damage to a permanent or player this turn, it deals that much damage +2 to that permanent or player instead. So now for each non-token creature we have that dies, Judith is going to deal 3 damage. This is a fantastic way for us to help close out games very quickly. And if all else fails, we can just cast Mob Rule. Mob Rule has choose 1. Gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater until the end of the turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until the end of the turn. Or gain control of all creatures with power 3 or less until the end of the turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until the end of the turn. So we're going to choose the effect that is more powerful depending on what the board state is. Then we're simply going to swing out with all those creatures and sacrifice them to ping and drain out our opponents. This is a fantastic card that can even just win us the game on its own. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, we're going to be running Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap to sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Then there's Rocky Tar Pit, which enters the battlefield tapped, and we can tap to sacrifice it to search our library for either a swamp or a mountain and put it onto the battlefield untapped. Next up is Judith and Grixis Panorama, both of which can tap for a colorless, or we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice them to search for either a swamp or a mountain and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Then there's Warp Landscape, which can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to search our library for basic land and put into play tapped. Up next, we're going to be running Urborg Volcano, Rakdos Guild Gate, Cinder Barrens, Bloodfell Caves, and Akulum Refuge. Each of these enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either black or red mana, and on top of that, Bloodfell Caves and Akulum Refuge are each going to gain us 1 life when they come into play. Finally, we're going to be running 25 basic lands in this deck, including 18 swamps and 7 mountains. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Judith EDH rec deck is going to set you back $345.88. Let's see if we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.90. And just a quick reminder that our deck cost actually doesn't include our commander because it is a commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned in focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades to see what some of those ways just might be. First up, there's Nether Trader, which comes in at $5.32. It's a 1/1 spirit with haste and shadow, and it costs black. It has whenever another creature is put into your graveyard from play, you may pay black if you do return Nether Trader from your graveyard to play. This is a fantastic creature that has an incredible ability to recur itself. And then there's Balthor the Defiled, which comes in at $3.78. Balthor is a 2/2 zombie dwarf that costs 2 black. It has all minions get +1/+1 and pay black, remove Balthor the Defiled from the game. Each player returns all black and red creatures from their graveyard to play. This is a fantastic way for us to recur all of our creatures at once. Next up, there's Blood Artist, which comes in at $3.28. Blood Artist is a 0/1 vampire that costs 1 and a black. It has whenever a Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is just pretty much a better version of Falkenrath Noble and a great addition to the deck. And then there's Impact Tremors, which comes in at $1.29. It's an enchantment that costs 1 and a red, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Impact Tremors deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is another fantastic way for us to ping down our opponents with our recurable creatures. Next up is Midnight Reaper, which comes in at $2.06. Midnight Reaper is a 3/2 zombie knight that costs 2 and a black. It says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. This is another great draw engine for the deck with a very small downside. And finally, there's Skull Clamp, which comes in at $2.95. It's an equipment that costs 1 and costs 1 to equip. It says equipped creature gets +1/-1, and whenever equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards. Skull Clamp is a fantastic addition to any deck that revolves around sacrificing creatures. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you think about this deck, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying decks like this one, or just individual cards, make sure you use that decklist link in the description below. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, and then check out some of our playlists on budget commander decks, commander excluded decks, and break the bank episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.